Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this instalment, Gal Gadot is Wonder Woman in her very own solo adventure. Diana, played by Gal Gadot, was Princess of the Amazons, daughter of Hippolyta, played by Kai Nielsen, and has been raised to be an extraordinary warrior on her home of Island Paradise, Themyscira. When spy Steve Trevor, played by Chris Pine, crashes a plane off their shores, Diana rescues him and becomes aware of World War I. Learning that Steve has information of a devastating hydrogen-based mustard gas developed by Dr. Maru, known as Dr. Poison, played by Elena Anea, that could change the course of the war. Convinced that Ares is behind the war, Diana leaves her home behind and follows Steve to end the fighting and save innocent lives. I have to admit I've not really been a fan of the DC Universe movies so far. They're just not my cup of tea, to put it very mildly. We'll just leave it at that because I don't think it's necessary or appropriate at this moment to expand upon that. And I'm not one of those people that does the whole Marvel versus DC thing. That's total nonsense. They can both coexist with each other and they can both make theoretically great movies. It's not football. I'm not rooting for one over the other. And for all my complaints about DC, I really genuinely wanted Wonder Woman to succeed. Because when you think about it, Marvel has existed as a studio unto itself for 9 years now, and they've had Black Widow as a character in that universe for 7, and yet they've still not had a solo female superhero movie. Talk about a massive own goal, guys. I mean, I know we have Captain Marvel on the way with Brie Larson, so that means that it'll be a full decade before they actually manage to do what DC has done in their 4th film. It's a huge card in their favour that DC did this, because the fact that we have a solo female superhero movie is a big deal. It's been something that we haven't really seen a lot of, thanks to the 1-2 punch of Catwoman and Elektra, both of which opened within 12 months of each other and effectively ended the whole female superhero movie. What Hollywood took from those films was that audiences didn't want to see, superhero movies anchored by women. And that's not what they should have taken from those movies. The fact those movies failed was because they were total unmitigated rubbish. They had nothing to do with the sexes of the main characters and everything to do that they were very poorly made trash. So the fact that Wonder Woman exists is almost an accomplishment in of itself. But what I really wanted Wonder Woman to do is prove my feelings about the DC Universe wrong. And boy, I'm so glad to be wrong about DC for a change, because Wonder Woman is absolutely brilliant. I think a huge reason why Wonder Woman works as well as it does is the casting of Gal Gadot in the title role. I remember when she was first announced, a lot of people were very sceptical about her, and I can completely understand why, because at the time she didn't have a lot of acting credits to her name, and she was best known for her work in the Fast and Furious series, which is not exactly known for its acting prowess. And I think fans were definitely wondering if she was the right fit for such an important character. However, a lot of my fears were allayed when I saw Batman v Superman, because she was easily one of my favourite things about that film. In terms of teasing us for her own solo movie, Gadot did a superb job in that film. She really embodied that character in a relatively small part to such powerful effect that I felt she overshadowed the 2 title characters in that film. And you can definitely see that in her own solo movie. There's no ifs, ands or buts about it. She is Wonder Woman. She embodies all the traits and characteristics of Wonder Woman on screen. I've seen a lot of reviewers compare her to Christopher Reeve in Superman, and it's a very valid comparison because both of them fit into their roles so well. I genuinely think that Gadot is going to be the standard that we compare future portrayals of Wonder Woman to, and I think it's a character that it's difficult to get right, more than you would suspect, and I can very much vouch for that because I was one of those unfortunate people that saw that TV pilot that definitely messed up the character and showed what not to do with this kind of role. Whereas Gadot, she delivers the role with such earnest conviction. I think that's where the Christopher Reeve comparisons really stand up, in that Christopher Reeve really got the character of Superman so well, in that he was very much this paragon of virtue. And that's what Wonder Woman is in her own way. She's very much upstanding for justice and valour and honesty. That kind of integrity is so firmly embodied by Gadot. She is so charming and so utterly convincing in the role that she just sells it completely. And I think she has a real confidence about her on screen, and she understands that that's an integral part of the character, that she's so headstrong and very much determined to fight. And even when the character is called upon to do fish out of water jokes as she's adjusting into this new world, she understands how to play those scenes, in that she's not really playing the character like she's a fool. That's how those sequences could have gone wrong. Instead, it's more to emphasise the fact that she just doesn't fit in this world, in this new world, and I would actually argue that's probably a good thing. But if you want to pinpoint the exact moment where Gadot really comes into her own in the movie, it's the first big action sequence where she's in full costume and she walks across no man's land. She walks out of the trench and just goes against the German soldiers with complete courage. And it's a moment in the movie that could have been maybe a little bit insensitive, or it wouldn't have played well, because we are playing in World War One, where real people fought and real people died. But it comes across as this big, rousing, heroic moment. You cheer for her in that particular sequence, and it's a moment where the character genuinely comes into her own and she becomes this powerful figure in her own right. And Gadot is completely convincing in that moment. I can totally understand that particular sequence in the film very quickly becoming iconic. I would actually describe this movie as a coming-of-age tale. Yes, it's technically a superhero origin movie and all that entails, so you have to explain all the things that make Wonder Woman who she is, but at its heart, for its first act, is the relationship between Diana and her mother Hippolyta, and that very much is what drives the first act of the film, in that Hippolyta desperately wants to protect her daughter. She doesn't really want her to engage in war and conflict, and yet Diana is attracted to that kind of thing, and she grows into her own person. It's almost like she's aware that her destiny is greater than what's on Themyscira, as much as her mother tries to pull her back. At the same time, though, she definitely grows up in a literal bubble. She's protected from the outside world, and so she's very inexperienced in that respect, because all she knows is peace, and her ideals are definitely very optimistic. When her mother says that she's too good for the world of men, that they don't deserve her, she's right, because she understands that that's a world that at the time was very much designed to quash those kind of ideals out of women, that they didn't recognise strong women like this. And when you talk about strong women, the Amazons on screen in this film are kind of remarkable in their own right, because you don't see a lot of that kind of imagery in the superhero genre. I like seeing this very different world, but there's definitely this idea at the heart of this first act that she's growing up as a person and realising that she has to fly the nest. She's almost like a teenager, and I think that a lot of young girls that are going to go see this movie will definitely recognise that mother-daughter dynamic in their own lives, and I think that gives it a lot of real emotional heft in the earlier portions of the movie. Certainly, I think the arrival of Steve in her world is the trigger for her own curiosity, in that she's never really seen a man before, but it also fires up her own ideals, hearing about this war and this great carnage and chaos, and Diana is definitely driven by this ideological spirit behind her, and that she has to fight, she has to stop this war because it's the right thing to do. And once she transitions over to the world of men, she finds that sort of binary good versus evil being distinctly challenged, because the world of men is a lot more complicated than that, and that brings into the war-related material, which I think the movie handles quite sensitively and with a lot of compassion as Diana goes to these battlefields and sees firsthand the real human cost of it. She travels over to the front and the first thing she sees is soldiers being carried away, missing limbs, and later you get civilian casualties, and mustard gas is a key part of the story, and very much this idea that weapons are being developed with the intention of creating these huge civilian casualties, and that sense of injustice, and this idea that men, the world of men, can do terrible, awful things, but they can also do huge, courageous things, and it very much relies on good spirits, as it were, to encourage the right kind of actions. And that's a recurring idea that goes all the way through Wonder Woman. As a figure, she becomes this noble spirit that very much empowers the rest of the war. And you can definitely see this in the dynamic between her and Chris Pine, who is a spy who himself has experienced firsthand the very worst that the war has to offer, and he's jaded by cynicism. And the two do butt heads during the course of the movie because Diana's so very forthright in her approach to problems, whereas Steve has been around long enough to realise that it's a lot more nuanced than that. And so he's usually the realist that's trying to pull her back, and at certain points she ignores him, and at certain points she concedes to him, and over the course of the film she begins to understand that kind of logic. She begins to understand the real complexities of the world that she's in. Their romantic relationship is very much meant to be an analogue for Diana's own feelings about the rest of humanity. That actually plays out quite well, and the whole idea of this conflict between these two worlds that she finds herself being divided upon is very much illustrated in the visual design of the movie, because Themyscira is in these very bright, very luxurious colours. It looks absolutely gorgeous on screen, whereas the war is very much in literal shades of grey that actually looks a lot more like the DC universe as we know it. But in terms of the DC universe, and in comparison to the rest of it, Wonder Woman, while it is a standalone movie, it also stands apart from the DC universe in terms of just how it approaches the characters. The DC films so far have been marked by a lot of cynicism in their approach to the material, I think, but what's refreshing about Wonder Woman is that that's largely absent from the proceedings. It very much feels like a movie that has a genuine heart and real positive energy behind it, and that's a real breath of fresh air. It's something that this kind of universe desperately needed, and while the movie definitely fits into the DC universe as a larger whole, with the whole bookending sequences in the present day that link it with Batman v Superman, for the most part, it does its own thing, and I think the movie is much stronger for doing that, and I think you can tell there's a very distinct voice behind the camera. I think Patty Jenkins brings a female POV to the superhero genre that's been lacking, and it's interesting to see as a male viewer all these role reversals happen, because it definitely sets Wonder Woman apart from a number of other superhero movies in the genre. So instead of a female love interest, we now have a male one, and he is to a certain extent objectified in the same way that many female superheroes or love interests are in the superhero genre. There's a moment in this movie where Chris Pine, he gets out of a bath and he's stark naked and he's cupping his genitals with his hands, and that's an amusing moment, but it's definitely fan service for the female members of the audience, and I was completely cool with that. It shows just how comfortable the film is in its own identity, and I think that in terms of its direction, Jenkins very much has supreme confidence in the material. The way that Jenkins frames the action sequences very much is about emphasising the power and speed of Wonder Woman, and that very much is emphasised with a lot of slow motion or speed ramping, and it certainly makes sense when you consider that this is meant to take place in a Zack Snyder universe that's very much calling to mind a lot of what he does in his films. Certainly the battle scene with the Amazons fairly early on in the movie movie actually reminded me a lot of a gender-flipped 300 in its own way, and it's just fascinating to watch Wonder Woman play out in this way, because it doesn't upend the conventions just simply because of the gender flip. It just feels like it's a little bit novel to see it play out in this kind of way. However, when I mention conventions, there are certain aspects of the superhero genre that Wonder Woman doesn't transcend. Chiefly, it has weak villains. Now, Danny Huston has played so many bad guys at this point that he could do it in his sleep. He doesn't do that. He's good in this movie, but there's not really much of a character for him to play. He's playing this German general that is supercharging himself with these inhalants, and they make him more of an even match for Diana, but the movie never really capitalizes on that idea. And that's how I felt about the two major villains in this movie, is that the film doesn't really do much with their characters. Dr. Poison herself, she has this very visually arresting and intriguing look about her, in that she's got the mask and the disfigurement. That makes you really interested in her, and you keep waiting for the film to really juxtapose her against Wonder Woman directly. You keep waiting for her to step forward as the movie's main focus or antagonist, or some kind of big reveal with her character, something to elaborate upon that. And she just goes through the movie, and the film doesn't really capitalise on the setup of her character. She is more setup than payoff, unfortunately. And that's a real shame. It feels like a waste of an intriguing character. The supporting cast do get the short shrift here, in that there's a lot of great talent in the supporting cast, but they come and go out of the film quite a bit. You have the likes of David Thewlis, Robin Wright. I quite liked Lucy Davis as Etta Candy. She provides some welcome comic relief in the initial scenes in London, but her character just sort of disappears out of the movie after a certain point, and that's a bit of a shame. I thought they could have done a little bit more with that character, or have her a bit more invested in what's going on. The other major complaint that I had with the movie is that there are unavoidable comparisons to the first Captain America movie. And I know what you're thinking, oh, comparing Marvel and DC, but they are two quite similar superheroes, and they have tried to avoid the comparison by changing the war that Wonder Woman's involved in to World War I, and that does make it a little bit different from the first Captain America movie to a certain extent. But in terms of plotting, it definitely nudges a little bit too close to it at certain points, because we have this character, this very noble, idealistic character that's paired with a bunch of ragtag soldiers, like in that movie. But the real big one is at the climax of the film. There's a certain element in the ending of the movie that feels very reminiscent of Captain America, the First Avenger, and I think most audiences will pick up on it to a distracting extent. It's unfortunate. It's the one bit I wish they could have really changed, because it just calls attention to the comparison when they really didn't need to. But for the most part, I really enjoyed Wonder Woman. If you're one of those people that's very critical of the DC Universe movies so far, go into this film with an open mind. It very much works as a standalone movie, and it does that tremendously well. In fact, if you haven't seen any of the DC films so far, this would be a great place to start, if I'm being perfectly honest. And I think the movie does so well in what it accomplishes. I think it's going to be very empowering to a generation of young women. I think it's great to see a greater amount of representation on screen, but even with that in mind, that's not the sole reason why I'm recommending this film. It works as a superhero movie. This isn't just a superhero for women, this is a superhero for everyone. And when I say that, as someone who has been more critical of DC films than most, you know I mean it. Wonder Woman is absolutely leaps and bounds ahead of the previous DC movies so far, and is in many ways quite different in approach from any of them, with an optimistic and hopeful spirit at its heart. The film works largely on the basis of Gal Gadot's casting as the Cincha character, and there's no denying she is Wonder Woman, embodying the ideals, bravery and integrity of the character that makes you want to cheer her on in each action scene. It's rousing, exciting stuff, and Patty Jenkins gives the film a different perspective than many other superheroes. superhero films, even if it does have some underutilized villains and some unavoidable comparisons with a similarly war-set Captain America the First Avenger, particularly at its climax. As a standalone adventure, this works a treat, particularly if, like myself, you didn't enjoy the previous films so far and makes you look forward to seeing more adventures with Gadot, finally giving us the great female superhero movie we've been hoping for at last. If you like this review, you can support my work over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early, among other perks. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.